Okay, hi, and welcome to the October edition of the Blue Thread, where this is the webinar where we discuss all aspects of water and environment with distinguished guests and friends of the webinar. My name is Mark Smith, and I am the Water Sector Director for RSK. Well, today we have a really good topic. We want to talk about sponge cities, radical solutions, preventing water emergency in urban areas. And I think it's a really topical subject again. As we know, in the face of climate crisis, the world is also facing a water crisis. We are seeing increasing urbanization as well worldwide, and according to the World Bank, today some 56% of the population, or 4.4 billion people, live in cities, which is a lot, but it is expected to rise to 70%, or another 1.1 billion people will move from the land, from rural settings into urban settings in the next 25 years. So cities are facing growing challenges around water management, and in some cases they're also experiencing extreme flooding and water shortages coexistently. This places extreme pressure on aging or even non-existent infrastructure, and water utilities around the world are struggling with how to manage it. So on the webinar today, we're going to discuss what could have been done differently, perhaps what should have been done differently in the past, but also what radical solutions do we need to take today to alleviate or to actually manage and help to solve the problems that are coming down the track. Because definitely water problems are not going to, there's no silver bullet here. It's going to take a long time and a lot of money, a lot of investment, a lot of culture change to enable us to get back to where we want to be. I think the guests, I know we have three great guests to discuss the topic today. And of course, they all bring to the table different experiences and expertises, and we're looking at it from different directions. So we'll be looking at it not just from the UK, it's also worldwide, but also not just academically, but how do we deliver it. But first, actually, just a bit of housekeeping, please. So as you know, the usual format is questions. The microphones are turned off. Any questions you have, please bang them into the questions into the questions spot, and I'll pick them up, or they'll be passed to me, and we'll try to get our guests to answer those questions. The usual social media, please put out hashtag Blue Thread. Let your friends, colleagues. This isn't an academic webinar. This isn't for water company or water sector people only. It's for everybody and anybody. We try to educate people rather than and have interesting discussions about things that we all care about. And of course, lastly, the thing I usually forget, which is the survey, is about an hour after this webinar has finished, excuse me, you'll get a survey in your inbox, and I would please ask you to fill that out. It helps us to try to customize this going forward to everybody's needs. So let's start. If we can bring the people online, the guests online. So I think just a few words. I think, what do we know today about cities and their ability to manage water? Well, that's very variable depending on where you're lucky to live. But I think everyone is familiar with the daily news reports of extreme rainfall causing flooding around the world. Just this week, actually, in Europe, Storm Ashley has caused flooding in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Last week, I noticed that France has major floods in the southeast after days of heavy rain, as did Italy and southern Europe. South Africa, severe flooding affected the Eastern Cape, and 1 million people have been hit by floods in South Sudan, with flash floods also reported as far apart as Connecticut and New Mexico in the USA. So I think meanwhile, we also hearing about water shortages. So everybody's probably heard about Cape Town. So we have Cape Town in 2017, I guess Chennai, India, 2019, Mexico City as well, and Santiago, Chile, are just among some cities that have come close to what they're calling, day zero, which is where that's the day when the water runs out, really. So a lot of these problems are happening together. There's a great book, actually, just for those of you who are interested in trying to read about something that's not non-academic, which is this book, which is by Tim Smedley, called The Last Drop, which I would recommend actually to better understand the scale of the world water crisis. And it's not just a depressing sort of list of sort of problems. It also has a good sort of outlook as to different ways of looking for solutions. So, and it is a genuine worldwide coverage, so I'd recommend that. But I think even with all these problems, people flock to our cities. And as I said, an extra 1.1 billion will move from the land to cities by 2050. Most of that movement is driven by economic necessity or economic desire, or indeed some by climate change, where the land becomes unmanageable. And most of it is happening in the global south, in Africa, in South America. So these are the parts of the world that will have to wrestle with these problems for the next 100 years. So I think it's quite interesting that climate change, which everyone agrees, I think, is with us, is happening. Certainly everybody on this podcast, on this webinar will agree. It will continue to drive even more extreme weather events. And I think most people globally will experience climate change through either lack of water, too much water, or perhaps both. So it'll be a water experience as much as a heat experience. You know, we can mitigate heat with air conditioning as long as the money is available. Water is very difficult. We can't live without it, and we can't live with too much of it. So I think most people will experience climate change through their interactions with water. In fact, I was in Morocco last week on a really interesting seminar, and they were talking about, you know, they were really worried about drought during the summer just a few months ago, and at the same time they experienced flooding in the desert. So you have those two problems coexisting. So where do we start with this? I think perhaps maybe we can start with some things that we can all agree on. You know, water is heavy, okay? So every time you move water, every time you pump water, it's expensive. So probably keeping water in the ground is better than having it flowing across the top of the ground, unless it's in a river. And keeping it and treating it and managing it as locally as possible is probably a good idea. So this whole idea of keeping water where it falls has coined the phrase sponge cities, which essentially means letting the city absorb the water into the ground and the benefits of that. But there's not just benefits, there's issues there as well. So we have spent many, many years building big pipes, big conduits to get water off our streets, get it into these pipes, get it down to the treatment plant. And of course, all of that is fine until we can't, those infrastructure can't cope with the amount of flow that's coming through now. So maybe it is possible to prevent floods locally, but also to replenish aquifers. And also there's a big benefit to having more water in the city because of temperature reduction. So maybe we could start the conversation, Nick, by having a chat about benefits. And before that, of course, I've forgotten, that's terrible. I should introduce my guests because I know these people. So first of all, I'll start with Nick. I'm really delighted to have welcome Nick from Nick Orman from WRC. He's a principal consultant in wastewater networks. I've worked with Nick for too many years, Nick, I think 30 years, over 30 years now. And his knowledge of UK sewerage infrastructure and its governance and regulation really is unsurpassed in my opinion. Nick is a chartered civil engineer and environmental manager and has worked on the development of UK standards, particularly in sustainable drainage for water UK, DEFRA, and of course the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. So he's also the secretary to European Standards Working Group for over 25 years and still development in the development and delivery of new standards. So it's great to have you with us, Nick. And next up we have Daniela Benfica. I hope I got that right, Daniela Benfica. So Daniela, delighted to have you with us. She's the Strategic Programs and Engagement Director at the International Water Association, the IWA. And Daniela, of course, is a civil engineer with a master's in water resource engineering and environmental sanitation. But I think, and one of the IWA programs that you are currently in charge of, Daniela, is the Inclusive Urban Sanitation and Climate Smart Utilities Initiative, which I think is right up, right in this topic. But even better is that in your past, Daniela was the Director General of the Porto Alegre City Stormwater Department in Brazil. So I think that whole expertise of actually being a practitioner and now being in IWA, and particularly with your an outlook in the global south, is something that will be really, really interesting. And lastly, we have Steve Kennedy. Again, Steve has been on this webinar before, so welcome back, Steve. And Steve is the head of digital and innovation at MWH Treatment. And MWH Treatment is a integrated design build contractor, currently delivering programs for 9 of the England's largest water companies. That's 9 out of 10, Steve, isn't it? So we won't ask you why not 10, but anyway. And I think that's really interesting here is Steve actually, he knows all about delivering these solutions. So you will ensure that we keep the conversation grounded, that we're not going off into academic things here, because ultimately we are talking about building things in very, very busy urban environments. So that's something that is a real challenge anyway, I think. But anyway, following on, and apologies again for not for the lack of introduction, but maybe Nick, could you start off maybe with helping us with a definition of, you know, the phrase sponge cities, where does it come from, what is it, how is it different to what we've done in the past, and we can maybe build it from there.
Well, the phrase extends, so it's only about 10 years around, but the concept behind it is much older. So a sponge city is an urban area that uses natural or green features in the event to absorb water, surface water. And that can range from parks, trees, other vegetation, and even use of small ponds and even green roofs. So individually, those concepts are much older than 10 years old. Some of them historic even, but modernized. So the term sustainable urban drainage or sustainable drainage has been around for at least 30 years, possibly longer. The concept has been around for longer. In Australia, they use the term water sensitive urban design, which I think has perhaps a bit broader, but also brings in sort of helpful concepts. Is that?
Yeah, I think essentially you're talking about, you know, the perhaps working with the environment rather than working or doing things to the environment. So I think you're talking about using the green spaces, you know, the parks and that type of thing as ways of actually managing water rather than trying to get it out of the city as fast as possible. Would that be right?
Yes.
Okay. And I think, you know, there are benefits to this, Daniela, but there are also, of course, problems with it, because I think it's not just like the magic silver bullet, is it? But maybe you could talk a little bit about the benefits of having sponge cities, or having, you know, embracing that type of that type of philosophy, I think, almost, and then some of the issues that you've experienced as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mark and Nick, for this introduction to the concept, right? And for highlighting that it's not something that is being created now. It's something that we've been trying to do for a long time, actually. So, of course, the main objective and the main benefits of sponge cities, or whatever you want to call this approach, are related to urban flooding. Of course, this is the objective, right? But they have like some side effects that are very positive as well, and can be explored. So the most obvious are environmental, right, related to the use of nature-based solutions or green solutions. So first of all, I would say maybe the most related to the original objective is the reduction of pollution, right? Especially diffuse pollution from stormwater runoff. We can think about also enhancing biodiversity, depending on the solution that you're using. Of course, this can be also a problem in hot weather. We have a lot of complaints that biodiversity of mosquitoes is a problem, and was a huge complaint from population in Brazil. What else? We can talk about also adaptation to climate change, and so it reduces the effect of heat islands. So this could be also an important aspect. And we could even think about carbon sequestration, depending on the solution used and depending on the area of vegetation that is used or not, right? There's some obvious also economical benefits, because as usual, when you solve a flooding problem, properties there, the price raise. And then if you add to this the fact that it's a nice place with like a urban, a nice urban landscape, let's say, it raises even more. And finally, we could think about also recreational and like contemplation aspects. We have parks, we have you can have areas for biking, you can have areas for communities to get together. So all of them can be either simply side effects or without being actually planned, or you can incorporate in the planning in a way that they contribute to an overall like urban project and not only a water project, right? Yes.
So it's essentially bringing people, I suppose, rather than separating the people from the environment, is bringing the environment into the cities, getting
exactly.
it more sort of used to it. I think it's a really interesting state comment there about biodiversity. We always think in the UK about biodiversity being good, you know, for
Yes, it is. Usually it is. Usually it is. And I think the water sensitive cities concept is the one that most address this holistic aspect, I would say.
Okay. But I think the fact that I remember I was in Sardinia a few years ago, and they talk a lot about draining the swamps so that they made it they got rid of malaria. And I guess ultimately what you're talking about is, you bring back in some of the water and you bring back in the mosquitoes. So something I suppose it just shows there's no such thing as a global solution. It's everything is fit for purpose. So I guess but Nick, or not Nick, sorry, Steve, we've built our cities in a certain way for the last 200 years. And we've used our roads with the nice curbs, higher than the surface so that the water flows down the road and all that type of thing. And now we're going to come along and sort of make them into sponge cities. So what are the engineering challenges of this? How do you even start? I suppose would be a good question.
So I think, Mark, you're absolutely right. We've got a legacy set up here that really looks to move water as quickly as possible from the point it lands into a river. And with climate change, we're seeing two impacts of climate change. You're seeing the very short, sharp, intense rainfall, so very, very high amounts of rain falling in a short period of time poses one set of problems, and also longer periods of rainfall over several days, which is a separate set of issues, because you capture that rain, you've got your flood, you've got your sponge cities. How much do you hold? Real challenge of working out the design of that side. So I think you've got the legacy problems, you've got climate change, you've got more people, less permeable surfaces. It's a really complex issue that encompasses a whole host of stakeholders, local government, authorities, highways, you mentioned there, water companies as well. So you've got a problem. You've got multiple stakeholders. You've got to work out, if you're going to make changes, how you're going to fund those changes. And in some areas, that's easier than others. In the UK, for instance, a lot of the funding is coming through the water companies, because people are seeing that they're paying for water. They're trying to reduce storm overflows. It's an easy way to get funding through to deliver the programs. The challenge is if it's seen as a water company's problem, how do you get that multi-agency approach to solving it? How do you get people bought into solving flooding as opposed to solving CSO overflows? So you got the funding, then you got to work out how they are delivered. And this is really where the challenges start to happen, because you've got a whole suite of solutions, but who's best placed to deliver that? And probably the delivery is linked through the funding. So the agencies that are receiving the money to solve the problems then start to deliver them. But the real challenge that I see is, once you started to get a delivery, the funding, the delivery mechanism in place, it's the time taken to make the changes. So where are you going? What volumes are you looking to reduce? What are the options for reducing those fundings? How feasible is it to achieve them? And then really, where are they going to be located? So again, you might have a delivery route and an opportunity, but how do you start to target? How do you focus where it's going to be? Where do you make the biggest impact from? And that makes it a really challenging problem to solve in both the short term and the medium term. But I think that the real challenge is that lots lots of improvements will bring benefits to certain events, but it takes time and significant time to see those in the round. So you may solve a small flooding problem that happens in a certain environment in a certain location, but improving and basically replumbing a city will take an awful lot of time. So you may see that you spend a lot of money in the short term and still you get the flooding issues in a short, sharp shower or a long-term winter event, but it's maintaining the trust over that period of time that's a real challenge to continue the funding over what could be 10, 15, 20 years to make a significant change.
I think that's really interesting. See, that phrase replumbing a city sort of brings it to life, doesn't it? Right? Because we have got certainly parts of the UK and globally, we have got what we call the combined sewer, right? Combined sewer system, right? So essentially we've got sewage going out of our houses. When it rains, the rain goes into the same pipe. Ideally, that would not happen. Now, Nick, you and I had a chat about this on a train a few weeks ago. And you reckon, actually, well, I won't put it in your mouth, but I remember we were talking about perhaps a 100-year program of complete separation of the systems. Is that something that you would start with? Or would you do that in parallel to some of what Steve was talking about?
I think the first thing is to stop building new developments as you add to your city, to stop building those developments in the traditional way, and to make quite sure you're not adding to the problem. The second thing is to remember that every bit of surface water connected area that you disconnect from the combined system improves the situation in the combined system. So it may be a 100-year program, but you can get benefits in certainly in 10 to 20 years. It's interesting to see in Severn Trent Water have been doing a pilot project in Mansfield on installing suds all over, retrofitting suds all over Mansfield, wherever they can find a space to put it. And it'd be interesting to see just what impact that has when it's completed. It's due to complete, I think, this year, and to see just what you can do in a short period of time. But that's not going to solve every flooding problem in Mansfield, but it'll hopefully make it less frequent.
So maybe one of the things is we have a situation where we are today. I mean, I think we're probably the only industry in the world who thinks our peak engineering was about 1880 or 1860 when Bazalgette was building, so 1850 or whatever it was. You know, we have come on so much from that, but people still talk about, you know, the Victorian sort of infrastructure, and walk along the embankment and you're walking along the top of Bazalgette's pipe and all this sort of stuff. But you know, we were chatting about this beforehand, Daniela, and you were saying there's three main issues, and I think we can come back to the funding bit. But what about acceptance? Let's start with people. You know, people live in cities, right? People go to cities because they've left the land or because their job is in the cities. They're young. It's vibrant. You can't do this to people, can you? You got to do it with people. And what's your experience of the acceptance of sponge cities by the population? And I hadn't thought of when I asked that question, I hadn't thought of the mosquitoes issue. So maybe you can sort of develop that as well. Sorry, Daniela, you seem to have gone quiet.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Well, we were discussing just before the webinar, right? Some challenges, right? Every time a new concept is becoming to get popular, we try we tend to jump into it as, okay, this is going to be solving our problems, right? So I remember back in Brazil when I was starting my career in the late 90s. Well, it was all about low impact development, right? This is going to be the solution for our city. And then later on, it was about water sensitive cities. This is going to water sensitive urban design. This is going to be solving our problems. And then now I'm not there anymore, but I'm assuming, and I'm seeing actually on social media, and sponge cities is going to solve our problems, right? If we do not address some key challenges that all approaches that are very similar face, well, we can come up with 10 new names to label it, and it will still not work, right? And one of them is the community. The point is that everything that is new, every change in our lives in general, not only, I'm not talking about water, I'm talking about anything, right? It comes with a cost, and it's really difficult to absorb and to work, right? Even if we acknowledge that the change is for better, even if we change, we move to a nicer house, let's say, but we have our friends in another neighborhood, right? We need to adapt. And then we're not talking here about individuals, right? We're talking about an entire community that have different perceptions, that have different needs, that value things in a different way. And so the solutions, it's easy to talk, but very difficult to implement. That is, you need to engage them, right? You need to have them since the beginning in the process of planning, and it's very beautiful. It's if you go to the IWA Water-Wise Cities Principles, it's the outer circle that's at the community engagement, right? But in fact, it's very difficult to implement. Even when we manage to have people on board, they still think like, not in my backyard, right? The approach is amazing. I totally agree. Now I understand, but but not here. Right, and so I'm not sure if this is applicable to countries like the UK, for instance, but in countries where you have high inequality, like in Brazil and many others in Latin America, we do face a problem of education. And believe it or not, the more educated the people are, my experience is that the more difficult it is to have them on board, because they have already defined what is good for them, and usually there are exceptions, but usually they do not face really the problem. They are in nice places, in nice areas. So my experience is that we had poor communities that faced serious flooding problems, and they were open to new ideas. They were very open, and of course they had to be educated. But we had them as allies in not such a long-term time. On the other hand, we had a very fancy neighborhood, let's say, that faced flooding problems in my city, and they tended to see the measures we were trying to implement as like second-class solutions. We don't have money to change all our pipes, and then you are trying to do that, right? And to be honest, this group, I would say that we never had them as allies. Even when we started implementing, they kind of accepted, but I accepted like, okay, it's this or nothing, so okay, let's do it, but not because they were convinced that this was a good solution. So anyway, then there's no like magic answer, but that would be involve a community since the early process of planning, but it's hard in terms of work, demanded from the organizations that are leading that, and also from this attitude, let's say, that some stakeholders might take.
So, but I suppose the one thing we can all agree on is that we should talk to people a bit more, right? Okay, so
all the time.
I mean, this consultation is really important. I was speaking to some people recently, and they only see 3 things from the water industry. They see, well, if you 4 things, if you talk about bad headlines, they have leaks, which they all hear about, right? Roadworks and bills, none of which are good things to sort of experience, right? But if you're talking about bringing nature into the city, prevent flooding, I can see how somebody who really hasn't got much of a road outside and they just want to stop the water flowing through the house can embrace any solution. If you have that posh house on that posh street, you probably don't, you just want the water to just disappear. You just don't want to, and just pay for it. So, but I think interestingly then, you know, if you think about that, another issue, and maybe Steve, you could talk about this one, is funding. You know, we're used to collection, transfer, either gravity or pumping it to a central point, treating it and discharging it into the environment. So taking it away from the city, all the sewage works are outside the city, all that sort of stuff. Is it more expensive? And maybe you could talk about not particular pound notes or dollars here, but is it generally more expensive to implement a sort of a urban scheme rather than an end of pipe scheme, so a diffuse solution instead of a sort of end of pipe scheme? And maybe you could comment on London's experience of building a big sewer under the city, rather than actually many green areas in London that perhaps are, or probably maybe should be more in terms of a subsidy. So where was that? Do you know? Can you talk a little bit to how that decision was taken as well? So cost, and then why London went for a big pipe rather than a more diffuse solution.
So I think the challenge with cost, a lot of this is not only the engineering aspects, but the time taken and the focus needed to make the change. So we've got a limited pool of engineers. If our engineers are focusing on making multiple small numbers of disconnections, it becomes, when you look at the benefit of it, it becomes a real focus. So I was going to say distraction, but I don't think it's a distraction because you're solving a real problem. But it becomes the primary focus is resolving that flooding. So it's a degree of prioritization in terms of cost. What is the most important thing that we're looking at, and how do we do it? I think in terms of cost, there's also got to be a realization of the multiple agencies and the multiple sources of the problems that we've got. It's not only a water company problem, it's a highways problem, but it's also a personal problem as well. If you choose to put a driveway in place of your front garden because you want to park your second or third car in that, you're creating and contributing to a problem. So how do we look at not only those improvements that you bring through new developments, and Nick sort of talked about that, we can't contribute, we can't add any further to the problem. So you've got developers and you can have legislation and rules around the new development, but how do you get funding to remove the problem, remove the challenges that are caused in individual households? So one way, for instance, and it's a radical change idea that I've posted on Water Climate Discussion, is around household management plans at the point of water sale. So at the point of house sale. So every time you move from a property, as a part of that process, you have to demonstrate that you have disconnected your runoff, that you have removed impermeable surfaces, that you have got water efficient goods in your property. So it becomes not an upfront cost, it sort of becomes a hidden cost of the sale or transfer. The challenge of doing something like that in the UK, when I did the research, there are 25 million dwellings in the UK, roughly 1 million of those are sold each year. So it's a 25-year program. Even if you implemented that, you got everyone on board to doing it to solve the problem. So that's a real issue. So why do we end up going down heavy engineering projects? Because of that time, because of that complexity. And what's happened in Thames, for instance, with the super sewer that's been constructed, is if we had 25, 30 years ago, when these solutions already existed, taken a different approach, we may not have required that, but we haven't. And how to solve a big problem like we've got at the moment quickly is by building a super sewer that moves that water out in the legacy way further downstream, mitigating the problems. But as we've talked about, if you've got to solve something quickly, you end up with heavy engineering solutions rather than dispersed, decentralized solutions.
That's quite interesting. I mean, ultimately, this isn't a discussion about the super sewer, but I think it's quite interesting that at a planning level there was a lot of objections to it. The other thing is cost £5 billion or something like that. So that's not a fantastically affordable solution to a lot of cities. But I mean, just moving it on a little bit. I mean, Nick, can Sponge City stop all surface water flooding? Is it possible to design a city, a modern city, and just not have flooding? Is that possible?
I don't think you can ever say never.
Excellent.
If you had a clean sheet of paper, my recipe for designing a city that doesn't flood would be to work out where the water is going to go and then put the buildings in the other places. You're in extreme weather, you're going to have controlled flooding will be your ideal. That you have overland flow movement in places where you can manage it, and that might mean having higher curbs, which lead some people to say, oh, but that would be a hazard, people would fall off them and hurt themselves. That will mean that perhaps the areas used for on-street parking might need to be used for other things. The highway engineers don't like the idea, or the traffic engineers don't like the idea of a road being used as a flood route, because in a flooding emergency, how do you get people around to deal with the emergency? Well, that's a planning issue. You plan some that are flood routes and some that are not. And there's this overall need for a city plan, I think, is probably one of the most difficult features, because you're changing everybody's perception. A highway engineer is brought up with the view that you must keep water off the surface of the road to preserve it, and that's ingrained into them. But actually, we can't do that all the time. So how do you manage a situation where you can tolerate it for a proportion of the time?
So it's all the engineers' fault, Nick. I always thought that anyway, to be honest. I think
it's changing culture.
Sorry?
It's changing culture.
It's changing culture. And again, that goes back to what Danielle was talking about. That takes time, that takes effort, that takes engagement and what have you. I am also minded, that in the parts of the UK that flood, we always get the helicopter shot of Tewkesbury and York and these places. The bits that are never flooded are the cathedrals, the medieval cities, because they're built in the right places. And I think, don't build on floodplains. It might be a good start. But perhaps that ship has sailed. So maybe we can look at decisions that we can take today, radical decisions, things that we can do today that we need for future resilience. Maybe Daniela, you could have a think about that. What should we be doing today in terms of radical thinking to actually help our colleagues of the future 20, 30 years time, so that they're not doing the same things that we're trying to do today?
Well, I'm going to bring again a practitioner perspective, as Stephen also is bringing, which I think it's very important here. First of all, acknowledge that the problem exists, because it's very flooding is something that doesn't happen all the time, right? And people's memory is really, really weak. So if you don't have water supply, this is something that affects you daily, right? If you don't have sewer, it's something that sanitation is something that affects you daily. But flooding affects you sometimes, right? So acknowledge that the problem exists and don't simply forget that, and let's face it again when it will happen. So this is probably the first thing. And I'm talking about the state, I'm talking about the operators, and I'm talking about population as well, right? So this would be probably the first topic. The second one is acknowledge responsibilities as well. As somebody was saying, I think it was you, Mark, that when you change some area in your plot and it's grass and you just decide to pave to park your car, you are contributing to the problem, right? So people tend not to acknowledge their responsibility, and also constructors and the developers. Then it's even worse, right? They never think that they are responsible for that. So this is something also to be addressed. And the second thing, the last thing that I would say is to have the focus on the entire life cycle. And I heard this from a friend who's a professor back in Brazil about what we did in our city. And they said, like, Porto Alegre, which means Happy Harbor, by the way, Porto Alegre did great in planning, did okay in executing, and did terribly in maintaining. And that was so true, so true. And he told me that years ago, but it's still valid, actually. And so we need to focus on the entire water cycle. We can have the better plan ever. If we don't execute it well, and if you don't address maintenance challenges, it's not going to work. So I would say that those three things: first of all, not forgetting the problem and addressing that when it happens again. Second, everybody being accountable by their responsibilities. And third, focus on the entire life cycle of the problem.
So I think
the solution, actually.
Well, I think actually it's really interesting. You know, flooding is one of those things. As I said, just talking about Morocco last week, they were saying, "Oh, we had no water," and then it rained, and then everyone stopped talking about it, and now we're fine until it happens again. And we've seen it here, you know, when it floods, everyone talks about, and then it stops raining, floods go away, everything's okay. And of course, drought is a far more severe thing, and certainly in the UK, we come very close to severe drought in 23, and I think before then 2016, 17, something. But we haven't actually quite got there, and you almost wonder what is the trigger point for people to actually change. So that's really interesting. But I guess, Nick, would you go further than that? Would you start talking about implementing some of these things, bringing them into law, into planning law, into actually forcing people to actually include these in their thinking, their developments? I like that sort of greater planning, okay at ops and awful at maintenance, which I think we could say about a lot of things. But you know a lot about the regulations, Nick, and the governance and what have you. Where do you sit with sort of the big hammer of the law forcing people to do things?
I think we've tried, certainly in England, the softly approach. We'd like you to do this, and basically it hasn't worked. In Scotland and more recently in Wales, they've tried a stronger regulatory approach, and that by and large has started to produce change. But that will only affect new developments. It's not going to change the existing urban area. And I think there is a stronger role for planning, but the planning system, certainly in the UK, it has lots of nuances to it that allow people to get round certain things, and stronger regulation certainly has a role. But there are other changes. For example, highway drainage in our existing urban areas is free to the highway authority. They don't have to pay for it, so they don't see the cost. I mean, there are a lot of problems created by saying they should pay for it, but because they don't see the cost, and they don't therefore factor it in. And the other thing is that we should try things. I think the Severn Trent pilot in Mansfield is great because it's somebody trying to do things and to try and see whether it's feasible, rather than turning around and saying, oh no, we can't do that, it's too difficult. There's another example going on at the moment in Portsmouth, where Southern Water are actually got some schemes to actually disconnect surface water from the combined system and connect them into a separate system at the property level, which has been something that for the last 20, 30 years, water companies have said, no, that's far too difficult. We'd be doing stuff on customers' premises. That's just too fraught with difficulty and customer backlash. So try some things, see whether they work, see if they're really as difficult as we think.
I think I don't think your idea of the highway drainage tax will go down very well. Actually.
No, I can see the problems with it.
Mark, if I may, just to complement, to bring an experience, I think that regulations are needed, but education is needed, and they need to work together. So an experience that we had, we were the first city in Brazil of a few, most of the cities don't do that, but we were one of the first one to do back in 2001 to pass a regulation, a city regulation, that all new houses or remodeling, right? When you were remodeling and you needed to approve it in the municipality, you need to reestablish a minimum volume of detention and a maximum discharge per house or building, right, per plot. And of course, it was calculated depending on how impervious the plot was. Anyway, so this was the law, right? And then it came to my attention, a friend of mine, an engineer that designed those devices, he said, like, he swore to me that he didn't do that other people did. He said, like, you know, there was this last paragraph in the law that was not added by us, was added by the parliament that approved, saying that unless there are strong technical reasons that do not allow this to be built. So there was this paragraph that we didn't like. So this friend of mine told me that other engineers, not him, would say to potential clients, I will charge you, I don't know, £1,000, let's say, to design the device you need. And I can charge you £2,000 to write a document listing technical issues that do not allow this to be constructed in your plot. And most people would pay $2,000 because then they would not have construction costs and they would not have maintenance costs. So I'm not talking about the owner. The owner had no idea how important this thing was, right? The owner was just trying to save some money. But the engineer, he was a professional. He was supposed to know how important that was. So my conclusion is regulation is key, but regulation without education does not work because the people find how to break the regulation.
I feel a webinar about who's worse, the engineers or the lawyers coming along, actually. But anyway, we'll worry about that later. Steve, a question has come in about pollution. We've talked a lot about water quality, not quality, sorry, quantity, you know, just sheer weight of water as it floods through. You know, what effect can or, you know, does sponge cities have on pollution? Because I guess you're not transporting large quantities of polluted water that, as Nick says, contain a lot of highway drainage on it. You know, you're keeping looking. Could you talk a little bit about that for us? You know, what effect does it have on pollution? Because we talk a lot about CSOs in this country, don't we? So
yeah, and it does have an effect on pollution. It has an effect on the quality of the water, both from a user's point of view. So the runoff has significant contaminants in there for people wanting to swim. It has an impact on biodiversity and health of the river. But it also has downstream impacts, particularly where the water supplies is coming from surface waters. It has a downstream impact on the water treatment that's provided back into the system as well. So if you've got greater amount of runoff, greater amount of pollutants in the water, you end up then paying again, because you have to pay for further treatment of the wastewater, of the water treatment plants to put the water back into supply. And we've seen that elsewhere. You need to pay to make the water treatment works, resilient to that flooding and everything else. So the pollution is a real challenge, and it was interesting when we were discussing about the drainage for water off the drainage from the highways, for instance. The cost of storing that and removing it is significant, but if you can try and couple in some way the cost with a reward from storing that water and providing it again during periods of low water demand. Yeah, you may have to treat it, but we're sort of saying you have to treat it anyhow. Suddenly you're not only introducing a cost, you're also introducing a revenue that could potentially offset it. So how do we couple the sponge cities with the drought problem, which in the UK we're seeing very wet weather, then very long periods of dry weather? How do we look at that holistically? Now, again, we all started out by saying this is a complex problem with multi different facets, with multiple stakeholders and educations, and now it's broadened out to the whole water cycle. But it is about that water cycle. It's how we benefit the environment, making sure that the decisions that we are making aren't just focused on one particular aspect, but the whole water environment and cycle and environment within which we live.
So I think I mean, I think that's really interesting, because it is complex, and the more you think of it, the more complex it gets, actually. Because at the end of the day, the water that's falling from the sky is the water we drink, right? Okay, and it's just managing that water and treating that water. And I guess the water industry, certainly in the UK and other parts of the world, get a kicking about, you know, discharges, because it's obvious, it comes through a pipe, right? Okay, and you can see it. I mean, Nick, do you have any information about how much of the pollution that is in rivers comes from diffuse, like roads and, you know, floods like that? Is that information available?
Yes, there is some stuff. It varies obviously between rivers, but
Of course.
I mean, there's a lot of controversy about the quality of the water in the River Wye at the moment.
Yeah, in Wales. Right?
And that in that case, the dominant source is actually agricultural runoff. Whereas there's also direct highway connections to rivers are a major source of pollution in many areas. And vegetative treatment systems, sustainable drainage, can contribute to that. One of the ironies is that because that's rather difficult to design to a specific discharge consent, there is I would advise against saying that you have to achieve a certain water quality from a highway discharge, because that will then lead it back to being an hard engineering solution. Yeah, you need to regulate in an intelligent way to achieve the outcomes you want. Yes, highway drainage is a major contribution. Agriculture is a major contribution. I think I've seen a sort of national picture. About a third of the water quality issues in rivers, on average, is from urban drainage, from water company discharges.
But I think you also introduce a very interesting thought process there, is that if we are going to, and this is the same with nature-based solutions, actually, that's being sort of the new thing, is that if we are going to move away from heavy engineering, hard engineering, grey engineering, whatever you want to call it, towards more environmental treatment, we got to move away from definite consents, don't we? We've got to accept a different sort of regulatory environment. And certainly in England and Wales at the moment, the Environment Agency isn't showing much interest in doing that. Would that be fair, or is that unfair?
Yeah, we've got to get away from numbers-based consents.
Yeah.
But possibly towards method-based consents.
Okay. So if you do this, then that's okay. Yeah. If you do this, then that's acceptable. Okay. I think that would be an interesting change, wouldn't it? Because At the moment, certainly a lot of the environment agencies around the world, and certainly the EPA in the US are like this. They are police. They consider themselves to be policing the legislation. If you got to police something, you got to have a limit, right? Okay, so like a speed limit on a road. Okay, so is 32 miles an hour okay? 29 miles an hour, I don't know. So
in Scotland, their approach to implementing sustainable drainage has been to take a rules-based approach, saying that they do not require a consent on an outfall, provided you put sustainable drainage in.
okay. And provided you don't find an engineer who tells you why you don't have to put sustainable drainage
yes,
in. Yeah, engineer.
So that's a I forgot the term for it now, but it's a sort of deemed consent. If you provide sustainable drainage as set out by Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, then you don't need a consent for this surface water discharge.
Okay. So maybe in the last couple of minutes, maybe we could have a quick word about technology. I mean, it's a really interesting webinar. It's the first time I've got through nearly the entire hour without somebody mentioning AI or digital. And maybe Daniela, you could have a quick, is there? I mean, we've agreed. I think there's no magic. There's no silver bullet here, right? There's nothing that you can say, bang, let's do this and fix it, right? But do you see technology has a growing role, or is it really more the hearts and minds in the community, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. Well, it might be controversial what I'm going to say because people are so focused on technology, but I don't think the problem is technology at all. Of course, technology has a lot to contribute and has already contributed, but it's not about that. And I'm going to again talk about an example. Once, a long time ago, I went to a congress in Brazil, to a conference, and there was this presentation. It was a paper presentation. I think it was a master's student, and the master's student was discussing how thick the geotextile, you say geotextile in English? The geotextile layer in infiltration trench should be. So he was experimenting with different thickness. And I was, as a practitioner, I was looking at that and thinking, okay, I understand this is research. I understand that this is important. But like, we have infiltration trench as one of the possible devices to be implemented in my city for at least 10 years in the regulation. And we never approved even one infiltration trench for a lot of reasons, right? And so, wow, it's not going to be applicable, right? So I think that technology evolved a lot, and we have a lot of possibilities to use. But if we don't address the gaps of financing, of policy and regulation, and financing, when I say financing, I'm not saying only CapEx, I'm not saying only to implement, but I'm saying OpEx as well, to operate and to maintain the structures. So financing, policy, regulation, and institutional, I would say even governance, right? Involving all the stakeholders in the entire process. We are not going to make progress. Maybe punctual in some geographies, in some specific contexts, yes, but not in general. So we can change the name, we can come with a new approach that is called something else. I really like the Sponge City branding. I think Sponge City is much more logical to non-technical audience than low-impact development, right? So I really like the branding of Sponge Cities, but we can come with new brands. If we don't address those challenges, we'll be having a similar webinar in 20 years and talking the same things.
Okay. Well, I hope we're not doing that, Daniela.
I hope so. I hope so.
I'll give we're out of time. I'll give the last word to Steve. Steve is head of innovation and digital at MWH Treatment. Daniela says technology is not the solution. So I guess you wouldn't agree with that, maybe, or maybe you would.
I would agree, to be honest.
Right.
It's about
good
people.
Man. That's the end of
it's
the
about
job then.
People. What technology can do is it can assist in what you're going to do and where, and to make sure that what you do brings the biggest benefit as quickly as possible, so that you reinforce that trust piece with people, that you really get people understanding and seeing that what you are doing is bringing a benefit, and there is an advantage of spending money and looking at it that way. So technology is there to support, and should always be there to support what we're doing, and to ensure that the investments are being made in the right way. But it won't be the answer to it.
Won't be the
Because
answer.
if you haven't
Okay.
got people on board, you won't get the funding, you won't get the compliance with it, you'll get it discarded, and then the technology will give you an answer that won't actually be seen in practice.
I have a feeling we'll be returning to this subject. I think it's been fantastic. It's been a great hour. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. We're out of time, so thank you very much to Nick and Daniela and Steve, and to those of you who've stayed with us for the hour, which is most people. Great. As I said, I think it's a complex. I started to think it was complex, and I ended up thinking it's super complex. Usually, I try to draw a few sort of strands together. I think probably the biggest thing that comes out of me: all solutions are local, and all solutions have to be done with the local population. And I think that's probably, if I could pull those two as the main thinkings, then everything gathers around that. But what a topic, what a conversation. And I'll end it on that. And just thank you very much to my three guests. And I'll see you next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.